Everybody. We are so glad to have as our first speaker of 2022, Dr. David Casarett, who is a palliative care physician, a researcher, and the director of the Duke Center for Palliative Care. He's a Renaissance writer, and that's what's so fun about Dr. Casarett is that in addition to writing 150 plus scientific articles, his writing has appeared in Salon, Esquire, Discover, Newsweek, the New York Times, and Wired. He's also written 2 novels and 3 nonfiction books, the most recent of which was Stoned, A Doctor's Case for Medical Marijuana. He also plays a critical role in the Journal for Palliative, Journal for Pain and Symptom Management, sorry, David, as our editor-in-chief. So we are just so glad to have him be here with us to launch off our new year in 2022, to get us excited about writing, and to also be the keynote for getting us started on our PCRC writing challenge that will start February 1. More on that later. Turn it over to you, David. Welcome so much thanks so much for being here.
Great. Thank you, Christine. I will say that I have had some experience writing, but I've never, ever in my life, Christine, written a poem. So I will leave that to the really hardcore writers. I can't touch that. Anything, Naomi or Christine, you wanted to say about the slide? This one sort of snuck in, I guess.
I'm happy to talk about this. So this is essentially the writing launch challenge, which we will start in February, and we'll talk more about it at the end. Turning it back over to you.
Okay. So this is a talk all about writing and surfing, which, as Christine just heard, is sort of my memorializing the fact that I was supposed to spend a week and a half surfing over the holidays, but spent it covering our clinical service for colleagues who were out sick. So this is me sort of vicariously living the surfing that I was supposed to have done a couple of weeks ago. But now that I'm done crying and whining, we can get on with the talk. With a question, and I would encourage all of you to enter answers if you have them in the chat, which I probably won't be able to see as I present, but you'll be able to see. And to think a little bit about what surfing, if anything, has to do with writing. And the answer to that question may be absolutely nothing. It's just a chance to show some cool pictures. So that's fine, but maybe give that some thought. I'll give you my answers.
There's some good answers already coming in, David.
Do you want to read them all?
Practice makes perfect. Practice makes perfect. Ride the wave and go with the flow. Practice, practice, practice. It takes practice to do it well and not drown. You don't always know which direction you're going in. Drifting, lots of highs and lows, and more, and even more wonderful things. So lots of good answers.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I like your answers better than I like mine, actually. So kind of keep those in the back of your mind. I'll go through mine quickly, but would love them.
And David, someone said that's a poem in the making. So maybe that's your first poem.
I don't know. I'm not sure I'm ready for that, but okay, fair enough. So some of these I think you already alluded to. The other one that I would add to that is the third one, and this is maybe more relevant to our topic now. Sorry, is that really the hardest parts, at least for me as a not very good but still passionate surfer, the hardest parts really are the beginning and the end. You get those right, and the actual surfing piece is relatively easy. And so that's why I really wanted to focus our talk today on what I think are 2 big pain points in writing, which is the beginning and the end, the intro and the discussion. So I'll walk you through strategies to manage the intro and the discussion. And then maybe if we have time, a few do's and don'ts right at the end to round things off. So introductions, why spend what is going to be about the next 15 minutes of all of our lives talking about introductions is partly for me because the first words of, this says the first words of a paper are the hardest. I think the first words of writing anything are the hardest, including, from my experience writing a couple of books. It's really hard to put down on paper the first couple of words of what's going to be a 100,000 word book. It's daunting. Where do you start? What's perfect enough to justify going on to the next sentence and the next and the next. It really is challenging. So part of my goal here is to give you a structure for writing an introduction that doesn't make it easier per se, but anything's easier with the structure. if you know what the first paragraph is supposed to be about, what the second paragraph is supposed to be about, and so on. The other reason to focus on an intro is not so much about just writing and getting over that activation energy and getting stuff on paper, but it's really a nice opportunity I found to clarify your thinking. You know, if you can say in 4 or 5 paragraphs what a paper is about, that's an opportunity to also be much more clear and specific and efficient to some degree about what your point is. And I usually tell people, if you know how to write a really good, succinct, clear, compelling introduction, that tells you how to communicate about what you're doing. And if you can do that, you can give a really good talk. If you can do that, you can give a really good elevator speech. If you do that, you can write a really, really good first paragraph bio in your bio sketch about who you are and what you do. So there are a lot of dividends down the road to writing a good introduction, be able to think in this way. So I would think about that, not just about how to write an introduction, but how this strategy of communication can pay dividends in other ways. And this is what I would ask you to consider. This is a proposition, you could argue with it, but this is something that I've kind of thought about in the definition that I've honed over the years. And that is that a really good introduction promises that if they're willing to read the next paragraph and the next and read all the way through to the end of the paper, this paper will tell them something, will answer a question, will open their minds in important ways, will cause them to think differently. You might be promising different things for different papers, but ultimately it's a promise. You want to give people 4 or 5 paragraphs at the outset that says, look, I know your time is valuable, but if you stick with this throughout this entire 3,000 words, you're going to be in a better position somehow. You'll know more, you'll think differently by the end. So it's really all about, in my view, and all about making a promise to people, and then making sure you keep that promise over the next 2,500 words. So a little bit of surfing, just by way of background. So you see here a wave or beginning of a wave, it's breaking from left to right. And the interesting thing about waves, and as I've gotten into surfing over the last couple of years, I've learned there's more physics to it than you might imagine from looking at the people who normally surf, because the guys I usually surf with do not look like physicists. But off to the left, you see little bumps of waves, and they're not catchable. Off to the right, you're catching waves that are far too late, and you get clobbered, but you don't really go anywhere. There's sort of an ideal place to catch a wave. And this is relevant, I think, to thinking about introductions, because there is a proper place to dive into an introduction, which I'll share with you in a minute, but a little bit more detail. So if you're out here, you're not going to catch a wave. You might get eaten by a shark. There is, by the way, a great white named Sarah who's cruising up and down the North Carolina coast. So it's probably just as well that I skipped that surfing holiday. And right here, that's too late. You catch a wave there. You wind up going head over heels, which is really, really embarrassing, but I confess also kind of fun, actually. It's one of my favorite parts of surfing, that somersault. But anyway, which I guess means I'm not a really true surfer, because I find way too much fun in those sorts of moments. But back to the introduction, you really want to figure out where you are and where you want to go. And that means reading your audience. And this is kind of an oversimplification, but if your audience is clueless, they know nothing about palliative care, nothing about the specific topic, communication, pain management, whatever it is you're focused on, you need a much harder lead in. And just like surfing a small wave, you're going to have to paddle much earlier and much harder. And in writing, you need a really, really aggressive introduction. You need to tell people, gory detail, what it is you're doing, why it's important, probably give them a little bit of history. You need a long, long paddle to get somebody up to speed. Whereas later in the process, if that wave is already breaking, you don't really need to paddle. A couple paddles and you pop up and you're done. So figuring out what your audience is will tell you a lot about how intensive to be in that introduction. And that's one thing to try to gauge as you start writing. So this is, if there's one slide you pay attention to in the next 40 minutes or so, it's this one. And these are steps that I've used probably writing a lot of papers, mentoring people write a lot of papers over the years. And it's not perfect. No structure is perfect, but it works pretty well. And it goes like this. First, you set the stage. You tell people what the paper is going to be about. You summarize what you know. You pose the question. or you state a position that's different than what we know. You explain why we need to answer that question or consider a new approach. Essentially, you say why this question is important. And then in the last paragraph, you spend a couple sentences telling people what they're going to get if they read that paper. It seems kind of dumb. And I look at this slide every time I discuss it, and I say, there's really more to writing than that, or at least I hope there is. But there actually isn't. I mean, there's a lot of detail to go into each of these paragraphs. But if you get this, it actually provides a lot of structure to get started, so that writing an introduction becomes not easy and certainly not formulaic, but it gives you enough structure so that you know what paragraph comes next and you know what goes in each paragraph. So I took an example of, and throughout this paper, this talk, I've taken examples of papers, either they're purely hypothetical or things that I've written or other people have written. And so this is just one example I'll start out with, which is a content analysis study that colleague Jessica Fishman did, studying the way that print media portrays end-of-life care and cancer. Just a little bit of background, so it's not totally out of left field. She looked at how hospice and palliative care were mentioned, whether people were described as surviving or dying when interviews with patients were done, side effects, and so on. And one of her findings was that print media descriptions of cancer overestimated the survival. So they interviewed far more people who were 5 years out and did well than the data would predict. Not incredibly interesting, but kind of novel. But the reason I wanted to present this is the kind of paper that it's kind of tough to write an intro for, because there's a lot of lead in. You have to explain why it's important. It's not obviously, at least wasn't intuitively obvious to me what this has to do with anything. So it's sort of a good intro challenge. And I'll use some examples from this as we go. So first, set the stage. Tell the reader what academic geography he or she wound up in. Give a little bit of background just so they know what the paper is going to be about, at least in broad terms. And I gave you an example from the paper here. You could read it. I don't need to read it for you, but anybody reading that sentence will know, all right, it's something about news media, it's something about chronic serious illnesses, and there's probably something about cancer, which seems trivial, but just that quick word search will tell readers broadly where they're going with this. In that first paragraph, you really need to keep it brief. The point really is just to orient the reader so they know, is this a study of neuropathic pain? Is this an opinion piece about assisted suicide? Like, just give me some sense of what direction this is going in, north, south, east, west. Assume that readers don't know a lot about the topic, and that's a pretty, in most cases, a pretty useful heuristic that you could dial back, but it's a good place to start. And then it's also good in that paragraph to use that as an opportunity to highlight incidence or prevalence. And these are some sentences that could appear there depending on the paper, but it's your chance, without really beating it to death, to say, this is a significant problem, and so whatever I say in the next 2,800 words is going to affect 1 million people, 500,000 people, or whatever. Next, paragraph 2. So again, I'm walking you through paragraph by paragraph and giving you kind of an overarching, if not structure, then at least a roadmap for where you can go. Summarize what you know. And the point here in the second paragraph really is to convince the editor and the reviewers that you've done your homework and that you have done enough of a literature review to say with confidence that if you say there's a gap in the literature, you want them to know that you've done enough homework so that they'll believe you. So this is an example from Jess's paper. Numerous studies have examined news media portrayals for a wide range of health-related topics. Be brief, but be thorough. And I think it's totally appropriate to use bulk citations. You don't have to, in fact, you don't want to, in fact, you probably shouldn't talk in detail about other papers, partly because it's not necessary, and partly because the more you talk about those other specific papers, the more reviewers are going to think, well, that seems kind of similar to what you're doing, which is definitely not what you want reviewers to start thinking. The exception, though, is if there is legitimately another very similar paper, you'd want to call that out. You'd want to describe that in a little bit more detail, and you'd want to say in more detail why your paper is different than that one. But this is really your chance to show that you've done the homework and to show that whatever question you're about to raise is being raised after a thorough review of the literature and by somebody, meaning you, with a thorough knowledge of what's out there, what people have studied, and what they haven't. This is also the perfect time in the intro to think about your various approaches, how much you need to paddle. Little tiny wave, you need to paddle a lot, or a bigger wave, you really just make a couple of strokes and then dive in. And so thinking about how much detail you need about what's already been known, sometimes that's just a couple of sentences. If it's an audience that's familiar with the topic, or if you're really working upstream and it's an audience that's not familiar with whatever you're doing, you might actually need to expand that second paragraph into 2 or 3 paragraphs. So you can be really clear about what's actually known. Then pose the question. What's missing in the literature? What has nobody examined? Here's an example, again, from Jess's study. So lots of studies out there, that was the previous paragraph, but no studies have examined news media portrayals of cancer at end-of-life care. The other thing I'd point out here, which I like to do, and it's really helpful when I see it in papers, is that, for instance, because I think there are often multiple questions in a paper, right? Just as there are dozens of questions in a study, but you don't want to list all of those because then it makes it really hard to follow, both for the reviewer or the reader to follow the intro and also to figure out where those questions track in the paper. So the advantage of doing something like this is if you give people one overarching question, meaning in this example, no studies have examined news media portrayals of cancer end-of-life care, that becomes the overarching guiding question. If there's one thing the reader takes away from the intro, that's what this paper is going to be about. And then there might be, if you want, a series of questions underneath that, but those questions are very explicitly subservient to that overarching question. So it doesn't become complicated, but it's a chance for you to say, for instance, we don't know how often news media include mentions of death and dying, or we don't know how often the news media mentions side effects of treatment, or we don't know whether certain news media outlets with larger subscriptions are more or less likely to talk about mortality. Those are some of the things she looked at. I mean, you don't want to list all of those as separate questions because then the reader has legitimate, I think, questions about, well, what is this paper about? I lost it after the second or third question. But if you can lump all of these questions under an overarching one, it gives people some warning about what you're going to talk about without seeming too scattered. And then this also works, by the way, the strategy of 5 paragraphs works pretty well for review articles and case reports. And I'm talking about a lot of this as if we're talking about empirical research, but it doesn't have to be. You could say there's a flaw in the current thinking where people have gotten it wrong. And I've given you a couple of examples here. Haldol is commonly accepted as first-line treatment of delirium, but maybe benzodiazepines might have a role. This paper is going to be about when, whether, and how that's the case, or the second example as well. So this strategy doesn't have to be limited only to empirical studies. I think it works well for other papers that we wind up writing. And then last, or almost last but not least, close the deal by convincing the reader that the question you just raised in the previous paragraph is important. And that's where, putting on my editor hat, I think that's where a lot of researchers in particular fall down, because you get so close to a question and your focus really is on answering that question and answering it hopefully in an elegant way, that you can lose sight sometimes about why it's important. And you can, especially when a lot of time goes by between coming up with an idea, writing a grant, revising a grant, getting it funded, doing the work, getting the results. It's easy sometimes, I think, to forget that really pithy, why you're doing it, obviously, but it's sometimes hard to forget that really pithy statement of this is why this is important. So here's an example. It's important to assess news media's reporting because news media reporting affects people's behavior. And again, for instance, or for example, to give people some idea of what you're actually talking about. But that paragraph really is key because it gives people a sense, not only that you're going to provide an answer at the end of the paper, but that answer is somehow important in terms of clinical care or teaching or policy or whatever else. Be direct. That's probably my best advice there. It's important to answer this question because, just say, and then be specific about how how that answer could change the world in the same way that you would if you're writing a grant, right? I mean, that's part of the overall significance section and impact of a grant application, explaining why what you're doing is important. Make sure you put that in the paper as well, and put it in the intro as a way of getting people to keep reading. And then last, and sometimes that last paragraph of the intro is hardest to write in a way, but just tie as much as you can to what you've said in the first 4 paragraphs. And I love a therefore statement. Like, you've taken people through what the paper is about, what you know, what you don't know, why it's important to know what you don't know. Therefore, the aim of the study was to, or our review is going to summarize the literature, because you've already said why this is important. Just say what you're going to do. And here's just one kind of walking through example. Again, I won't read this, but patients are increasingly using inpatient hospice, previous studies. However, it's not known. It's important to know the best setting of care. Therefore, the goal of the study was to compare family satisfaction scores for patients who die in these 2 settings. I mean, honestly, there's probably not a whole lot you need. You could probably do a 1 paragraph intro using those sentences, and with a few references, you'd be done. It's not always that easy, obviously, but as much as you can strive for that, keeping it really, really simple. And as long as you can focus on those key points, you'll get the reader through the introduction and engaged in the paper much, much more quickly, which really is the goal. If I didn't say that before, to keep the reader engaged and starting to look at results before they lose interest or get distracted by a kid or a barking dog. So for a review article, you can do the same thing. Neuropathic pain is common. Recent research evidence has produced growing evidence that suggests that topical lidocaine may be effective, but conflicting opinions about IV lidocaine. It's important because, therefore, this review will summarize. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And by the time people get to that 5th topical sentence, they should know what the paper's about and why they should keep reading, hopefully. At least that's the point. So set the stage, summarize what we know, pose the question, state your position, close the deal, explain why we need to answer the question, consider a new approach, think differently, whatever it is, and promise the reader that's exactly what they'll get if they keep reading for the next 2,500 words. So that's an intro. Let me walk you through a discussion and then some pointers at the end. And then Naomi, Christine, if it's okay, I'll just save time for questions at the end. I learned this before, but it really is, at least in my experience, really, really true. I think for me, the pain point is, I mean, for me, honestly, the discussion is the hardest part, followed by the intro, and everything else is kind of formulaic. I mean, you wrote a grant, probably, so you take the methods section of the grant and you put it in the methods section of the paper, you tweak a little bit, and you're done. The results section, you've got a table 1, you talk about table 1, and so on. I'm not saying it's writing the results is easy, but it's pretty easy because there's a pretty clearly written out 1, 2, 3, in the same way that, the hardest parts of surfing are the first 2 seconds and the last 2 seconds. Everything else is, even for, a novice, not particularly good surfer like me, is relatively easy. So why is the discussion so hard? I'll just reflect on my reasons. Yours might be different. I mean, for me, it's kind of anticlimactic. You've already told people why this is important to answer this question. You've already answered the question. So what do you say? Well, obviously there are things to say, but it could be a little bit challenging, I think, for me sometimes to figure out, well, how do I keep this going? And then that last paragraph gets me every time. How do you end a paper without sounding really trite? More research is needed. I think, to cut to the chase, the answer might be just be trite, because nobody reads the last paragraph anyway. Don't agonize over it, but we'll get there. One big word of advice, and this is, I think, another place where, putting on my editor hat again, I see folks fall down, no pun intended, is I think people who have done a lot of research, have thought about a topic a lot, have looked at these data a lot, have a lot of thoughts, opinions, insights into the data that they're describing. Again, this is, using the lens of an empirical paper, which may or may not be substantiated by the data. So that's a long way of saying, as you start thinking about the discussion, make sure that what you're talking about in the discussion is very, very directly related to the study you did and the results you presented. It's really easy to go off on a tangent and to talk about how finding is relevant to policy and how that policy is important and what that policy might look like, which is sometimes fair, but is going to get caught by editors and reviewers pretty quickly. And you don't really have much of a leash to go out on when you're writing the discussion. I think my strongest advice would be to keep fairly close to the results. And if you have opinions, ideas about policy or how this could be translated into new educational initiatives, you can mention it, but that's probably a separate paper. So here's a parallel structure to what I presented for the introduction. Remind people of what you did, what you found, why it's important, all in one paragraph. I mean, that's sort of my ideal first paragraph if you could do it. And here's one example. Just this may have come from a real study, although I don't think so. I think I just made it up. Sort of setting stage again to remind people where they are. Patients with advanced cancer often rely on outpatient palliative care, but travel is important. In this study, we found that X, Y, and Z. And then there are 3 findings from the study that are particularly, use whatever adjective you want, important, interesting, intriguing, surprising, policy worthy, whatever. And then use that as a way of framing some of the key points in the discussion, because I think one of the other ways that I've seen discussions fall apart is when it's pretty clear that a researcher can't figure out in his or her own mind what the 2 or 3 or at most 4 key points of the study are. And there are 10 things that they're just super interested about with all sorts of implications and ramifications, and they want to talk about them all. And not only does that get you into word limit trouble pretty quickly, but you've lost the attention span of all but the most compulsive reviewers and readers at that point. So it really does help to think in terms of a couple of key findings, focus on those, really make the most of those, explain why they're important. And maybe there's some other implications that you just don't have a chance to talk about. And that's too bad, but being at least fairly realistic in what your reader will be able to latch onto is important. So 3 to 4 at most, try to use 1 paragraph for each if you can. And don't be afraid to have a little bit of fun and to devote 1 or maybe 2 of those to something that's weird or confusing to you, meaning, this is important because this is important because, and frankly, we found this, but we don't really know why. One explanation is this, another explanation is that, but we don't really know. And that's totally fair, and probably heads off some reviewers who are going to want you to explain exactly why you found the result that you did. Better to say up front, we don't know, but further research is needed. Acknowledge limitations. And here's one which I think is common knowledge to everybody, and hopefully we all do that for all the obvious reasons. And one format that I like is to point out a limitation, describe why you think you've been able to limit its impact, but acknowledge that possibly that limitation still remains. And yeah, here's one example. So again, made up, we used a variety of strategies to ensure that our participants were representative, but the population overemphasized patients under 40. But additional weighted analysis didn't alter our results. So that's our answer. Like, I don't think this really was important. There's limitation, but it's not a big deal. Nevertheless, I guess it's possible that our study population may differ. So you basically said, yes, there's limitation. We really don't think it's such a big deal, but I guess it could be. And you could reverse those or rearrange them depending on how much emphasis you want to put. If you really, really, really don't think it's a big deal, you could use the first point and the second point and then stop. Say, look, we adjusted it. We looked at it a couple of different ways, so we don't think it's a big deal. But as much as you can, try to frame the limitations in terms of what it could be, the problem that you've unearthed, and why you don't think it's a big deal. And then last, again, I admitted this is probably the hardest paragraph in any paper for me to write. Keep it short. You've already described your results, why they're important. We've also described them again in discussion. You can really stop anytime now, I think. If all else fails, a call for future research is needed is always a great way to end a paper. There's a reason why it's fairly common. Pretty much everybody ends a paper that way. So I won't read this for you, but it's sort of a typical end of discussion paragraph. Increasing evidence demonstrates this, sort of going back to the intro, setting the stage. In this study, one sentence about what you found, and then sort of a nod toward what future research might look like and where that might go, without giving a whole lot of detail and without telling people exactly what study you plan to do next. And then, like I said, this is always the challenge for me, that dismount at the end. There are graceful ways to do it. There are not so graceful ways to do it, which is usually my preferred exit from the surfboard. Not usually as graceful as this guy is managing to do it, or at least not with as much altitude, fortunately for me and my bone health. But there are lots of ways to end a paper. And I think, some of it's just coming up with your own style, figuring out what it is, having almost a stock ending paragraph that you use, with some modifications, but just call on that whenever you need it, rather than spending a lot of time agonizing over what is honestly a paragraph that not many people are going to read, or if they read, they're not going to spend a whole lot of time on. So how are we doing for time? Still okay. So a couple of do's and don'ts, and then we can wrap up. I think I made a list of 7 for each, or at least I meant to. Whether I actually got around to it, I'm not really sure. So some of these are pretty obvious. I won't belabor them. Just pointing out a couple of things. That intro really is important, and acknowledging the existing literature really is. I just assume, as I alluded to before, but didn't maybe say as explicitly as I should have, the people who are reviewing your paper will be people who have written the articles that you're citing. So it's really, really important to acknowledge that literature, not calling it out in depth, but making sure that reviewer who did a Cochrane review 2 years ago, who is kind of irked because nobody reads or cites that Cochrane review, is going to be looking to make sure that you at least read and cited that Cochrane review. And if you don't, that reviewer is going to take you to task for it. So make sure you cite it. Focus the results on what's really important, and do the same in the discussion, and certainly acknowledge the limitations in the discussion as well, as we talked about. Things don't to do, things not to do. Good grammar. Actually, that's a perfect example. Please take a look at grammar, have somebody else read it. I won't say that I've ever rejected a paper outright because there were typos in the title. I wouldn't say that publicly, and I wouldn't admit it, but man, you see a paper with a typo in the title, and it increases your pretest probability that this is not a great manuscript. And I'm sure other editors, other reviewers do the same thing. So title, abstract, intro, if you've got typos in your manuscript, at least try to keep them to the end, at the point where somebody's already made a decision about whether this is valuable. But you hit somebody with grammatical errors or typos in the first couple of paragraphs, and it's really hard to claw your way back from that. Don't overstate the novelty of what you're doing. It's really cool work. All of us do really cool work. It's innovative, it's novel, but there are a lot of other people doing novel work out there, and those are the people who are going to review your manuscript. So if you overstate how cool, innovative, important your work is, they're going to push back. Don't rely on overly clever graphs. And one pet peeve of mine is think really carefully about whether you actually need a graph. One pet peeve is, like a 5-bar graph that presents 5 numbers. Like, you could do that in a sentence. You really don't need the page space that a graph takes. So, think about what goes in graphs, what goes in text, and be judicious. No new results in the discussion section. That's got to be a hard and fast rule. Like, nothing new after that discussion heading. Not every result. And I've mentioned that before, but this is kind of a different nuance. Try to tell a story. try to tell a story that's related to the plot. So if you've got a plot of a novel, characters do things to sort of advance the story. As one of my editors told me once, that's a great scene and that dialogue is awesome, but it has absolutely nothing to do to advance the storyline you're trying to work on here. So she cut out that entire 2-page section, which I loved, but she didn't. Actually, one other hint, since I'm sort of rambling now, but just something to think about if we have time, which we do. There's a story, maybe apocryphal, but I found it really, really useful and I've taken it to heart. So the story goes back to like IBM in the 70s. And all of these computer engineers had really super cluttered desks. And so management was worried that nobody could find anything. It looked awful and it was a fire hazard. So they tried to get these engineers to throw more pieces of paper out more frequently. And so they increased the frequency of trash collection from once a week to twice a week. And pretty soon they were collecting trash every day, but they still couldn't get these engineers to unload stuff off their desks and put it in the trash until they finally discovered the problem. It wasn't like people didn't want to throw things out. They just didn't want to lose them. They really wanted the ability to pull things back from the trash if they decided a day or a week later that they didn't need those anymore. So they implemented a policy not of collecting the trash more often, but of less often. And finally, they created a system of filing cabinets that were also trash bins. So trash would basically sit there for a month before it got collected. So you could throw something out knowing that you'd have another 30 days to drag it back if you decided to change your mind and you wanted it. And that's when people started getting rid of their trash. And I just mentioned that because it can be really, really hard to cut stuff from a paper. There's a favorite paragraph you've written in a novel or really important, wise overview of what you're doing and why, or a crucial insight into data. You don't want to lose it. And so what I often do is keep kind of a shadow folder of paragraphs I love. So rather than deleting something, if I really, really like it, but can't bear to get rid of it, I just copy, cut, paste into this separate folder. So it's there. So if I ever want to go back and find it, it's there. And that makes it easier, I think, for me to cut, whether it's writing fiction or nonfiction. And a couple books I've written, that kind of spare text file turned out to be much longer than the actual book was, which gives you a sense of how inefficiently I write, but it really makes it much easier to cut. So that's one trick I would share with you. If cutting what you've written is really a challenge, just put it in another file, and then you can always go visit it whenever you want. And in the discussion, don't rely on readers to draw the same conclusions that you did. Remind them of what you found, why it's important. They may have something different, and really, really, really try to keep it short. The JPSM gets requests to extend word limits all the time. And people who say, look, this is a really complicated study. I couldn't possibly describe it in less than 3,500 words. I think we all know that there are a lot of big, complex studies that get published in the New England Journal of Medicine with a much tighter word limit. And those papers are valuable, well understood, well read, and well cited, despite a really tight word limit. So it's possible to write a very cohesive, compelling paper, whether it's an opinion piece or an empirical piece, in 3,500 words or less. And I would encourage you to try to stick with that and really make that your goal. Also, maybe sometimes to try to really push yourself. Maybe the word limit is 3,500 for a journal, but to see if you could do it in 3,000 or less. Because I guarantee you can. And I also guarantee you that the practice of honing your argument to get it under the word limit, sometimes significantly, is really good, probably the best writing practice. So this is where we've been in 40 minutes, more or less. Intro, discussion, a few pearls along the way. And then just a little bit of wisdom for what it's worth. I think the background of writing papers is getting papers published, and there's a home for every article. Very few articles are left in the wakes of researchers that never ever found a home. So it's just a matter of revising, having some patience, and then finding the right home, and not trying to stretch too much, and knowing when this revision is not going to be possible, and it's time to try another journal. Like paddling into that wave is not going to work. Just wait for the next one, because that next wave will come. So let me stop there, I think. I'll turn it back over to Christine. But thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to do this. It's been a pleasure to put these thoughts together. Really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you, David, for an incredibly concrete, practical presentation. I think that will help everybody do better in their writing. We have some questions, and I'd like to start here, and others may come. Please feel free to put your questions in the question and answer field. Our first question is, how definitive should we be in saying no studies examine XYZ versus the data on XYZ is limited?
It's a great question. I'll give you my thought, which is, if it's true that no study has examined this, then I would say that. Because it's such a bold statement, I would probably reference it thoroughly and probably say something like, no studies have examined this. A couple studies have been close, like X, Y, and Z. So if you're thinking that you have an exception to what I just said, I'm going to tell you you're wrong. This study looked at this, this study looked at this. This study was close, but still not quite. So I think if you can get away with saying nobody's examined it and you can provide the evidence to support that, then you should definitely do it. If you can't, then use a weaker statement, but definitely go for the stronger statement if you think you can support it.
Great. Another question, in the results section, how much does one have to repeat what is in the tables versus summarizing? Like, for example, in parentheses, see table X.
Yeah, I'll give you my opinion about this, but I think if you survey 10 editors, you'd wind up with 10 different opinions. I really don't think you should summarize it all. Maybe a little bit about demographics and some key results, but I think you're taking up the reader's time by looking at tables and by reading text, and you don't want them to do both. I would almost think of the tables as a menu, and the waiter is telling you, look, this is a 5-page menu, but if you want appetizer recommendations, I would really think about the spring rolls and the crab rangoon. And for entrees, I would think about this and this. That's kind of the way I would review the results. If you've got plenty of room and you're kind of thin on results and you're having trouble figuring out how am I ever going to write 3,500 words, then I think it's fine to use the text. And there are always things that have to go in the text, whether it's subgroup analyses often, or you're looking at interaction terms and effect modification, the nuances that are really hard to summarize in a table, then that's kind of stuff I would reserve the text for. But if it's something like, table 1, that's another pet peeve of mine, is there's no earthly reason to describe what proportion of your subject population is between 40 and 50, between 51 and 60, if all of that is in table 1. Does that help?
That's great. I think that's really useful. And I think probably a lot of people haven't thought about that. So that's terrific. So another question for you, David, is the issue around activation energy. That is, you have a paper, you need to get back at it. It's been a while. Everything in you wants to not actually work on that paper. How do you overcome issues around activation energy, and particularly for a paper that you haven't been at for a while?
I know I'm about to say something that might get me muted or kicked off this, but there's. And I'll give you some tips in a minute, but I would have to say first, if there really is a paper that you really just don't have the enthusiasm to work on, like every time you look at it, you say, oh, I'm going to go do some more data analysis, or I'm going to follow up on some of my patients' charts or whatever. There might be a message there, meaning that this is just something, for whatever reason, you're not that excited about. That doesn't mean you should drop it, but I would definitely be aware and note that, especially if that happens with some papers and not with others. You're really, really enthusiastic about this one, but you're not so enthusiastic about that one. One paper is still stuck at the intro stage. The other one is on its second revision in Annals of Internal Medicine. There's some signal there that you should probably be paying attention to. If that's happening all the time with all of your papers, then that's probably a different issue. I think I didn't say this up front, but I'll say it now. I think one of the reasons why I got into palliative care research is because I love writing, and we all have our guilty pleasures. Mine are surfing and writing, and actually one of my guilty pleasures is really editing. I just love sitting down with a manuscript and doing macro and micro editing. Just love it for the same reasons that I love just sitting down with a data set. It's fun. So if that's your thing, and I think for some people it is, some people are much more comfortable. They enjoy the editing process more than they love the putting words on paper phase. And so that's maybe something else to know. If you're getting stuck on that manuscript that Christine mentioned because you just can't get words on the page, then looking to some of your collaborators to give you some ideas, suggestions for, what results should we talk about, and giving you a little bit more structure. Because sometimes it's easier to come up with a couple paragraphs about the finding that you found really interesting, effect modification by race. Don't know what it means, but that's something you could write about. Whereas if you're really getting stuck on the editing phase, then bringing in some of your collaborators to help with that. So I think that's helpful. The other piece of advice I would give you is, I got this from another writer named Rick Powers, who is just a brilliant guy. If you haven't read any of his stuff, you definitely should. It's really, really interesting. But he's a formidable and really just very capacious writer. I mean, his output is incredible. And he was telling me once he often early in his career got writer's block, which is hard to imagine. But he said that it's often easier to write if you narrow the field. The more you focus. Writing a paper is hard. Writing something about one particular research result is a whole lot easier. And so to focus on little tiny bits and pieces, just one at a time. And it clearly worked for Rick, so I think it could probably work for the rest of us mortals. But again, I would go back to that first point, that if there's something you're really not enthusiastic about, it's just painful, you don't enjoy it. I mean, think introspectively about what that says about, not what that says about you as a researcher, as a writer, but what that says about your relationship with that particular topic, with that particular study. And there's certainly studies that I've let die. I just didn't really feel like doing another revision, wasn't all that interesting, wasn't all that enthusiastic about it. So I've let them go.
Great input. So another question, do you have additional advice for qualitative research and mixed methods studies?
I guess I'll answer that question specifically as it relates to trying to get that published, because I think it can be a challenge. It is a challenge. And I think a lot of journals don't privilege that nearly as much as they should. And I think one of the reasons we brought Deb Parker Oliver onto the associate editor team at JPSM is that's a kind of research that she's passionate about. And she's been, I think, an editor for that work, but also an advocate for it. She's pushed us to make sure that the journal really does represent both qualitative work and mixed methods work. I think this is probably a scattershot answer, and therefore either not helpful or kind of heterogeneously helpful in a lot of different ways. But I think the two thoughts off the cuff would be, definitely be extra clear in the intro about why these methods are perfect for this particular question. And even I would think about weaving that into what we know and what we don't know. Lots and lots of quantitative data on the epidemiology of CPR in advanced heart failure, but nobody's really taken a look in a qualitative way about how these decisions are made. So it's not like nobody studied this, but nobody studied it in this way. And then being clear about in your promise to the readers about what mixed methods or what qualitative methods add to this. Like, yeah, we know the epi, but that's only half the story, number one. And then number two, I think in the methods section, being really, really clear to people who don't know what mixed methods research is, what it is and what you actually did, and specifically how those two pieces are related, and how the qualitative work informs the quantitative analysis and vice versa. That's probably the most important part of the real estate in that method section, and making sure that you're clear about it, partly so reviewers and editors know what you did, but also so there's some faith that you really did legitimate mixed methods research, and it wasn't just a study with some p-values and some interviews, and you threw it together in a paper and called it mixed methods because, well, there's a qualitative component and there's a quantitative component, so therefore I'm going to call it mixed methods research because that sounds better. And I think there's definitely some skepticism among reviewers and editors about that approach. So the more you can be clear in the methods section that no, this is really legitimate linked research in which both sets of results inform and influence and complement the other. I think those would be my key bits of advice, but I'll probably think of something as soon as this talk is over.
Great. We have 2 more questions and a poem for you, David. So let me just first ask you probably a brief question, and another one that may take a little bit more of your thinking. And the first question is, what are your thoughts about active versus passive voice?
Oh, man. I think passive voice is like a fungus that's grown on the medical literature, like, nasty fungus grows and eats a tree trunk. I mean, it's sorry, it's probably more metaphor than you really wanted, but it's not helpful. Like the passive voice takes more words. It's harder to read. I think that's probably my key take home point. If I say blood results were collected, it's much harder cognitively for people to understand than saying we drew blood from 18 people, because that's the way we talk. And it's sort of easier. It's easier to understand because that's the way we talk and that's the way we communicate. And reading the passive voice is kind of like reading a foreign language, because we're seeing verbs and prepositions that are out of order. Like, we can figure it out. It's not like, we're reading Swahili, but it takes extra work. And if there's one key message to this presentation, particularly what we talked about in the introduction, you don't want to make work for readers. You want to make it as easy as possible. And in my mind, passive voice just makes it harder. So I would definitely avoid it as much as you can.
So Dina, there's your answer. Passive voice is like fungus. And then our last question for you before the poem is, what is your daily routine practice that you've implemented to improve your writing skills?
Oh, yeah, that was before I took on a chief job and had a kid. So yeah, can I maybe think back 3 3/4 years before Joshua was born, because that kind of threw a monkey wrench into things. I mean, it kind of depends. I mean, I'll give you kind of a facetious answer, but writing takes a lot of forms, and for me at least, I think the challenge always has been that I want to write for an audience. I can't. People who keep journals, I have all the admiration in the world for them. But I can't bring myself to do that. And partly it's time. But I can't bring myself to sit down and spend any amount of time writing something that doesn't have at least a non-zero probability of seeing the light of day. That does not mean, by the way, that everything I've ever written has been published. I think Christine mentioned a couple novels that I've had published. I've got a couple more sitting on my hard drive that I think are pretty cool, but nobody else does. So there's certainly no shame in writing stuff that never gets published. Like that's, whether you're talking fiction or nonfiction or academic research, that's par for the course. But it's hard for me to write without knowing that there's at least some hypothetical audience out there. And so I think my approach has always been to try to figure out what I'm writing for, and then to gradually chip away at that. And it's kind of a non-answer to the question, but it is an answer in the sense that I need some hypothetical audience out there, number one. And number two, I need some unobstructed time. And for me, that time has always been, and this is maybe a question to ask yourselves, that time, particularly when I've been working on nonfiction books, which take more time than it seems like they should, because you're just reporting facts, but it's a lot of work. And for me, it's always been early in the morning. And particularly the other thing about nonfiction books, which some of you might know, is that a publisher will give you an advance and then they have a deadline. And so they'll say, look, we need the finished manuscript by such and such a date. So that's sort of an enforced way of saying, all right, you better write 1,000 words every day, otherwise you're not going to hit that deadline. And so having that deadline is also helpful to me. And then for me, the best times to write are early in the morning. So even now, I tend to get up before everybody else, often before my mother-in-law, who has dementia, who lives with us, but I don't always beat her up. But definitely I can beat my 4-year-old, and I can definitely get up before my wife. And that usually gives me anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour in the morning. And sometimes that's writing, sometimes that's thinking, sometimes it's scribbling. But for me, it's carving out that time. And then the last thing I'll say is that some people really like setting themselves a word target, and plenty of famous writers do this. They say, I'm going to write 1,000 words a day. And when I write my 1,000, I'm done. And that's never really worked for me. I certainly, especially when I've got a book deadline, I think about that. If I get up every morning and write, but just don't produce that much, I'm definitely aware that I'm falling behind schedule, but it just seems like too much pressure. So I usually think of things that I want to write, like I'm going to write the scene of a novel, or I'm going to write this section of a book, or this op-ed or whatever. And then try to give myself a time limit. And I tend to be more time limited. Well, by default,
Well, that
I
takes
don't
us
have to.
that
Yeah.
takes us to our writing challenge, so which we'll talk about in just a minute. But I just want to celebrate I think the first PCRC webinar participant-based poem that's put forward by Mary Ellen Potts. So thank you, Mary Ellen. And here it is. Surfing is uncertain direction, drifting, feeling like drowning, practice, going with the flow, balance, experiencing highs and lows, risk, being thrown off, getting right back up and knowing, ... So is writing. So there is your first PCRC participant poem inspired by you, David. So thank you. And
Thank you.
what we'd like to just end on is our PCRC writing challenge. We will be starting a PCRC writing challenge that will begin on February 1, where each of you, just like what David was saying, will commit to writing 30 minutes a day during the work week through the month of February. It'll be a support group of sorts. We'll give you some hopefully pep talks and words of encouragement along the way, and you can also share words of encouragement with each other. When you get your survey back from this PCRC webinar, you'll be given an opportunity to sign up for the PCRC Writing Challenge, and we'll also put out a general announcement to the PCRC community. So we hope you'll do this. We know that it can be hard, but it's much more fun to suffer together than to suffer alone. And especially if you're struggling with your writing and need just a little bit of encouragement, hopefully this will do that for you. So thanks again, David, for a very enriching time together. And already we've gotten lots of positive feedback, and we wish you all well in the rest of this day and the rest of January.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ritchie, and thank you so much, David. Stay tuned for an immediate post survey, and have a great day, everyone.